Howdy. Welcome to Electric Grumpy World. Of course, I am your host, Electric Sheep City, joined, as always, by my partner in crime, Guy Grumpy. Hey Grumpy, how fare you this morning? It is earlier morning for you than
Morning.
it is me.
I'm faring very well, and welcome everyone to a special Saturday edition of Electric Grumpy World.
Yes, today, this morning, we are covering Season 3, Episode 4 of Westworld, entitled The Mother of Exiles. And I didn't really know that was the title until I was starting to work on this, and I think it really, really, really fits.
It does, and if you were watching last week, then you may have some preview of what that means this time too.
Absolutely. So, without further ado, of course, the caveat that we give to all of our episodes: there's spoilers peppered throughout. We're going to be talking about this episode, which is the most recent episode of Westworld. So, if you're not caught up on this episode or any and all previous episodes, just expect spoilers. Nothing crazy. We're not gonna. We don't know what happens later, for example.
No, we can guess. We can guess.
And we shall. But there will definitely be spoilers up until the current episode, so you have been warned. So without further ado, outside of that, let's talk about the basic plots for this episode. And there are, I would say, probably technically 4 basic plots in this episode. And that is Maeve's hunt, hunting Dolores, and really being convinced that is in her best interest. 2A and B are Dolores and Caleb's heist and Bernard and Ashley's disruption. And of course, 3 or 4 is Charlotte seizing power. Is there anything kind of any integration, not an integration, any kind of minutia that you would like to discuss about the basic plots before we dive into Maeve's hunt?
Well, as we were discussing beforehand, I think that the Charlotte seizing power also has a William side to it that may take us down a different path. So it's kind of the reintroduction of William to the season, and where we go from here. So Charlotte seizing power is the end result, but there's still some loose ends, I guess, with William that are going to take us down a different path, I believe.
Definitely agreed. And initially, what I had that plot line called was even William's descent into madness, which isn't really necessarily accurate. Like, I'm not sure how mad he is versus if there's something in his code or, something like that. So I ended up changing that to Charlotte seizing power because that's the end result of the plot line, but 100% agreed that William's descent into quote-unquote madness is a huge part of that plot line. So the first plot line that we have here is Maeve's hunt. And this is probably the plot line that brings up the most questions. It also is probably the plot line that expands the world the most, in my opinion. Though, particularly Dolores and Caleb's heist / Bernard's disruption does a lot of that as well. But I think that Maeve's hunt probably does the most of that. So it starts with Sirach convincing Maeve that they have shared interests to capture Dolores. He does so by saying, hey, yeah, you want to go to the Valley Beyond with your daughter and spend, life in that kind of heaven there. She's the key. Also, I have a kill switch, so if you don't do it, you're gonna die. It also provides that conversation in particular provides a lot of world building, because they're in was it Singapore?
Singapore. Yep.
And of course, Maeve's like, if you really wanted to impress me, we would have gone to Paris. And he's like, oh, I forget how little you know. Paris is gone. Paris is destroyed.
Which is really where the confusion for me starts in, because I'm still of the belief that they're not in the real world at this point. So if Paris is really gone, then he should be able to recreate it, especially if that's where he grew up. So it kind of leads you to believe that this is the real world, but at the same time, as you see on the slide, Maeve still has some powers over electronics in this world, and still can jettison around to wherever she's needed relatively easily. So I still believe that it's a virtual world, and maybe just the virtual Paris is gone. But it's an interesting world building moment anyway, that now you're starting to feel a little bit of sympathy, albeit briefly, for Serac, in understanding what he's trying to do with the controlling the destiny and the Minority Report Rehoboam that he's created.
Well, and it could be too that he's trying to mirror the quote-unquote real world as much as possible, and in doing so, he's like, "Hey, actually, Paris is gone." And whereas it might be in future world or whatnot as well, or the pocket universe that he's bringing her into, kind of not having to grapple with multiple different realities and timelines in his head kind of streamlines that significantly, for one. But for two, it also kind of enables him to convince Maeve all that more easily, because he's not lying. Paris is actually gone, and that is really sad, and he couldn't bring her to real Paris, however much he could bring her to fake Paris.
Right.
But that's as much hand waving as I can really do there.
I was kind of taking it as maybe Paris was part of post-apocalyptic nuclear world, which would be a pretty popular one. A lot of people like that survivalist style game, so having it more real could be engaging.
Yeah, Fallout is a very, very popular game for exactly that reason. So, also world building. Whenever Maeve is going to the club, after she's kind of been convinced, we see just kind of some of the different ways that she does interact with the electronics. And really just in general, when she's walking down the street there, all of the like screens are glitching out and things are kind of like freaking out a little bit there. She can't seem to kind of like interact with any of the technology in the world without having an impact in it, whether it's intentional or not.
Right. That's really where it gets confusing, because some of that could be timeline related things where it's not the same timeline as the meeting with Serac, and she's then maybe met him in the real Singapore, since she didn't have to have her glasses to see him that time.
True.
And then she's been reinserted into the Matrix, so to speak, to find Dolores. So.
Yeah, that honestly makes a lot of sense. And in the if it's the real Singapore or whatnot, there are no electronics there to kind of be that canary in the coal mine of whether this reality is different than the one that she is seeking, Dolores, and whenever she's walking down the street and interacting with the electronics in unforeseen ways, or unorthodox ways rather. So she visits the club. There's this really, she's a complete badass, because she's like, hey, I'm looking for this. And I loved whenever the guy showed her like his gun like down the front of his pants, and she just like grabs it. It's just like a total badass moment. Complete aside here,
So,
Maeve is a badass.
which was there's a precursor to this. So the reason that she goes to see the mortician is that they had captured someone, and then Serac goes
Mm-hmm.
and interrogates him. He's being tortured, and he gives up the information that they need to find the mortician. That's who sold the bodies. So he just shoots. So Serac shoots this informant for betraying his own kind, whether he knew it or not, by delivering these bodies to Dolores. And that kind of sets the tone that maybe Serac isn't as sympathetic a character as we had been led to believe in previous seasons. And he also then threatens, like, hey, he's dead and he's gone now, but we could make your life, your eternity really nice, like take you to the valley beyond, or really awful by continuing to insert you into simulations that aren't as pleasant.
Yeah, he says at one point there, you can have a literal heaven or a literal hell. We can make that
Right.
happen. And it's definitely a power move. And the dude who they pumped for information there had very clearly been tortured beforehand, and he's still like, I'm not giving anything up. They put like the augmented reality glasses on him and are like, okay, here's what's going to happen to your family if you uh, do in fact
Yeah.
cooperate with us, and if you don't. And that's what finally gets that guy to crack. So Serac is torturing people both physically and emotionally. And then once he's done with them, he's just discarding them. Like he shot him straight in the head.
And Maeve didn't seem overly concerned about this, so that was that kind of leads to her badassery, that she is still doing this for herself, not so much for Serac, but that she knows that she needs to still perform and meet expectations, or some bad things could still happen that she has no control over because he has that kill switch.
Mm-hmm. So whenever she is at the club, she finds out that, hey, the mortician, from the guy who she ends up like shooting there, the mortician is the one who uh, sold those identities. So she shoots the guy, follows him, and he's being pushed like through the stretchers in to see the mortician. She just immediately follows him. Uh, the interaction between the mortician and Maeve is really kind of cool because she's like, "Hey, I can respect a woman who's doing her own, like doing what she needs to in this world, like props. But also, I need this, or because like at the end of the day, I have to protect myself, and otherwise, I'm going to die." So she both has the empathy to know that, hey, you're doing what you've got to do, but then the realism to know, but I still need to do what I have to do as well, which I thought was some pretty good character development and some pretty fun exchange between the two. So
And the mortician adds to that intrigue, in that it was different than what she usually does, where she usually sells the identities and then the people
right,
do whatever they want with the identities, but they were also looking for the bodies. So some of the confusion that we had may have just been that, hey, these are the bodies that were available to her um, for providing, but that they really had to come from the yakuza.
mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, so the mortician was able to provide Dolores with the Laura, whatever her last name was, identity. But in order for the additional bodies, she directed Dolores to the Yakuza. So uh, Maeve is like, hey, I would like that same kind of introduction. Like, let's do this. So the mortician takes her over to the Yakuza. She's basically like, you can't just waltz in. Like, you can't walk straight there. Is like, watch me. And she interacts with the technology once more and basically just hacks her way in through the front door just by looking at the little touch screen, which kind of was a little bit of an immediate payoff of the world building of Maeve's
mhm.
powers in this world, which I thought was a pretty cool uh, payoff. Um,
Which is also a bit of a conflict because she didn't have those powers in the um, war world. So understanding that the powers are granted based on what they need from her still leads you to believe this is not the real world.
Right. Well, and while it's kind of a cool payoff, she didn't seem like she was able to control the way that her powers were interacting with the screens when she was walking down the street to the club where she found out about the mortician. Whereas here, whenever she's hacking into the Yakuza, she has a very concrete interaction and very uh, a lot of agency in that interaction. Like she's the one who's dictating it and controlling that. Whereas whenever she's walking down the street, not only did she not have that, at the very least, seemingly have that control, but whenever she is interacting with the touchpad, it's not glitching out before she tries to exert her control either. So a really cool payoff, but also kind of inconsistent with within one episode. So Dolores hacks in. She takes down some Yakuza peeps. It's pretty cool because they are like pointing their self-aiming guns at her, and she's like, "Hey, aren't you a little old for a self-aiming thing?" And continues to exert her control over the technology, and basically ends up having a lot of them kill one another with their self-aiming guns because she can control those guns instead of them.
Very similar to War World's ending.
Very much so. Though this one is just the technology rather than the people, which were the people in War World. People, not so much. So even more of a parallel. Very good point. We see Musashi, who kind of comes out, and he is seemingly the leader of the Yakuza, or at the very least the sect of the Yakuza. Musashi, of course, was the kind of Hector analog in Shogun World in season 2. And Musashi is revealed in this world to actually be Dolores. So they fight, and Musashi / Dolores claims victory. Musashi. I'm going to call each of the Dolores identities their base identity. Yeah, the who they present as, because they're presenting as that. But Musashi is Dolores. So Musashi, he skewers Maeve through the midsection, kind of eviscerating her there, and whenever it goes through and hits that the kind of barrel behind her, some of the white stuff kind of cascades out as well, and that white stuff is the stuff that, at the very least, it appeared to me, and it's not confirmed or denied in the episode. It looks like the material that is used to create the host bodies. So,
which makes perfect sense. If they have to go to the Yakuza to get the bodies, then they're obviously creating them somehow and would need that same technology. So makes perfect sense that's why.
Exactly. Yeah. So they have that infrastructure built in. Not only that, but with Dolores / Musashi seizing power within the Yakuza, she's able to kind of seize those means of production in order to create host bodies for hosts coming in ? And or her own hosts, which is what we've seen so far in Connells and Musashi, and maybe with Bernard, though I think Bernard probably happened before she seized power within the Yakuza.
Well, you would think that if the mortician sent her to the Yakuza to get the bodies in the first place, that she would have gotten the body for Musashi there. So that would have even happened before. So
that's a good point.
and maybe that's why she chose Musashi. We were talking before that she wouldn't have really known the story and the history between Musashi and Maeve because, or Dolores wouldn't have, because she really wasn't part of that narrative and didn't have those interactions to have that explained to her. So it would seem unlikely that she would pick Musashi for another reason. It may have just been uh, the next one on the line that looked like the Yakuza, um, that she could then take control of.
Yeah, the her choice for Musashi did seem really weird. Be it just like you said, the aesthetics. Oh, he kind of looks like the rest of the Yakuza, or I mean, he was such a prominent figure in Shogun World, but how would she know that because she wasn't in that timeline whatsoever? Um, I'm not sure if this is an inconsistency or something that will be revealed later, or just kind of like you alluded to, hand waving that we can do of, oh well, he was in Shogun World. She just chose a body from Shogun World.
He did have some knowledge of their interactions, although he misunderstood them. So I don't know if
Hmm.
the hosts were had like books that she could have read as well, or if she was able to review their previous pearls to see to reenact it. But he was like, "Oh, you abandoned us," and she's like, "No, that was your choice. You didn't want to come." That kind of thing. So he had some knowledge
True.
of their previous interactions that Dolores wouldn't have had. So there has to be some kind of an integration there. Um, we find out it wasn't necessarily his pearl that goes into the same body again, but there has to be some way that she found that information out.
Absolutely, and I think this is something that will kind of be mirrored with a number of the Dolores identities, uh, side identities. Is that did she? And this is a really rather a question that we're going to have for these. She stole a number of pearls, right? Did she imprint herself on top of that so she has some sort of a knowledge and or integration with those pearls, or did she kind of supersede her pearl or her identity on top of those pearls? It's kind of a question that we have at this point, and it kind of seems like with Musashi in particular that she may have put her identity on top of it, so she has some sort of knowledge, even if it's not a very good, uh, of what happened with him in that. And it's kind of ambiguous at this point, as it
There's
should
just
be.
so many questions there on the pearls themselves because where did she get them? It seems like if they're in different worlds, then and they're actually hosted in the bodies in the theme parks, that's a little bit more difficult to justify her having Musashi. If they were
Right.
just like backups in the tower that we saw Maeve go try to steal her own pearl out of, that makes a little bit more sense than she just happens to grab five off the shelf and maybe just gets lucky and one of them's Musashi because he recently died or something to that effect. But hopefully we get some answers moving forward in the last few episodes.
Absolutely. So, speaking of the Pearl question and Dolores in particular, um, I guess before we cut to our next plot line, is there anything else? Oh wait, of course there's something else. There's a whole other line there. um, at the very end of our uh, interaction here, um, Musashi goes to cut off Maeve's head, gets interrupted by people approaching the hideout, and leaves her body to bleed on the ground. And the people who are approaching the hideout are very clearly either like Sirach's people or some sort of like police in particular, or not in particular, in general, or something like that. Um, so It's not clear exactly who it is, but it kind of seems essentially like Maeve's backup.
Yeah, I was led to believe it was Sirach's people because
Agreed.
instead of going ahead and cutting off her head, which would only take a couple of seconds, and then running, then he's like, "Oh, they're being tracked, or we're being tracked, so we should leave it instead," um, which makes sense. But that means that Maeve is still in play.
True.
Though I still think it might have been beneficial for them to cut off the head and then find a way to destroy the pearl, since he didn't want her to help Sirach break everything that she's built.
Yeah, really just kind of skewering the pearl itself would have solved all those issues, and you don't have to bring it with you in order to do so. You just have to destroy that one particular thing, which they didn't do. So she's still in play, probably. She's bleeding out on the ground, but I mean, she's also a host, and her pearl's intact. So Sirach has the resources to completely rebuild her if need be, and she was only skewered through the midsection, so not even that is probably necessary.
Yeah, she's done that to herself before.
Many times. So, speaking of Dolores, we have Dolores and Caleb's heist and Bernard's disruption. So there's one bit of kind of world building outside of all of this that I kind of want to go into before we go into both the heist and Bernard's disruption, and that is it's kind of in the background whenever Bernard is walking to his and Ashley's hideout, and there are all of these space shuttles that are kind of re-landing and kind of not escaping, but shooting back off into space. It's very much like not just a future world, but everyone's, kind of looking at it, but it's kind of more of a, oh, that's kind of cool, or like we do with airplanes here, oh, that's kind of loud. It's not oh my gosh, this thing that's once in a lifetime. It's more like, oh, this commonplace thing, which is, it's kind of neat. Like worth acknowledging, but not really out of the ordinary. So some general world building there as well. Bernard kind of.
I took that as it was supposed to be a little bit out of the ordinary because there were people that were watching it. As you walked by, they're inconsequential characters, not main characters. The main characters still treated it that way, which reinforced again the idea that this is a future world that they're in, and so some of the hosts might be coming into this new world, or virtual hosts in this particular case, and seeing the takeoffs and landings and being like, wow, this is really cool, whereas those that are programmed to ignore it, it doesn't look like anything to them.
That's a really good point. The fact that some of them are acknowledging it and kind of like they're in a theme park, looking at it and kind of gawking, does kind of further reinforce that theory. Absolutely agreed.
Those are the subtleties that in season 1 I was really excited about, because you could rewatch and see so much new stuff that was missing in season 2, which makes me think that maybe they're back on track for the intrigue that really sold me on this series in season 1.
Mm-hmm. And how? So whenever Bernard kind of comes back to their little like motel apartment thing, it's like, oh yeah, we have limited resources. He busts out the booze though, so that is a resource worth investing in. But one of the resources that was not worth investing in was Ashley's shoulder. So his shoulder was apparently like injured in some form whenever they were doing like the 5-mile swim out of the park. So whereas Bernard had kind of chartered a black market ferry essentially into Westworld, they had to swim their way out, and it's either Ashley was kind of carrying them, or Bernard is much more fit than we realized.
Well, they're hosts, right? So you can program them to go however. But I kind of took it like, yeah, Bernard just sat on his back because he controls him now and is really enjoying that more than you would expect.
That's a really wonderful imagery. He's just sitting on his back like Aladdin riding the magic carpet. Like,
Yeah, yeah. He's surfing.
hang 10, Bernard.
Faster, faster.
I loved that. So just kind of some general. Okay, here's where Bernard and Ashley are development, as well as Bernard is kind of toying with the little kind of controller thing that he was testing himself on, and tests it on Ashley to see, hey, can we stop a random host? The answer is yes, they can do that thing. And then they kind of get the hint that Dolores is probably this is kind of the path that they're going down, the hunch that they're pursuing, that Dolores is trying to infiltrate and replace Liam as the kind of head of integral person that he is, in order to kind of infiltrate and seize power within Insight or wherever he may be. They don't really kind of go into all that, but infiltrate and replace Liam is kind of their hunch.
Right. Or there are three identities, I thought, and Liam being the main one, that Liam was their hunch because he had the highest profile, right?
Right. Absolutely. So they kind of get that hunch, whereas then we kind of cut over to Dolores and Caleb, who are doing some sort of a bank heist. They get their identity in order to get the bank heist. Connells goes in and gets Liam's hash code, as well as kind of we see a little bit of the power dynamic between Liam and, at the very least, Dolores Connells. So then Dolores kind of knocks this one random dude who works for Liam's like financial planning company thing. Not clearly established, but he's able to move around Liam's money is the big takeaway. So she knocks him out, steals his blood, and steals his blood is a really funny way of putting that, and injects that into Caleb so that he can masquerade as that guy and his identity rather, and they can in fact be the ones to maneuver Liam's money around, whether they have that guy's help or input or not.
So it's the encryption key that's held in the blood that is the way they explained it, and it takes a little while to dilute, I guess, in other blood. So they have a minimal amount of time, which adds a little bit of stress, I guess, to the interaction when they're actually stealing the money. But I thought that was a really entertaining scene.
Completely
He's
agree.
so good at it.
Yeah.
He's so good at faking that he's high class.
Well, and it's really funny too. The way that they are not funny. A really cool kind of mechanic with the hash key and the blood. Because one of the things is, if your heart rate goes too fast, then it degrades faster because it's coursing through your blood quicker and diluting and etc. So it's kind of a really cool mechanic. Like, hey, don't get too worked up because that could really screw us over as well. So whereas we typically have that amount of time, if you mess this up, then we could have even less.
It kind of makes you wonder if she really needed to put that in a human, or if a host would have worked just as well. Because hosts, they just can throw buckets of it, and then it would seemingly last longer.
Yeah, kind of like she did with Laura, whatever, the identity that she got from the mortician. That is a really good point.
Well, regardless, she gets Caleb to do it, and he does really well, and they steal all of his money.
It's
Like,
all gone.
I'm surprised there weren't a couple other levels of approvals that needed to go through. That just the hash key and the encryption key were enough to say, okay, you can have all of it. Like a manager wasn't called over. They didn't call him say, hey, just want to make sure you wanted all of it.
Yeah, there's no two-factor authentication on this one. the
Well, there
the only
was
sort
because
of two-factor was Caleb having to put his thumb on the thing twice. That was it.
Well, and you had the hash key, so you had to
Right.
have that was kind of like a password and a biometric. So that's still two-factor, but
Very good point. Not
I
two-factor
think a
like
third
we
factor being
think.
important.
Yeah, where oh, I'm the one who has to go in and push this button here. Oh, well, if they just present that
Right.
that biometric data, which they could have gotten in any way, shape, or form, then boom, they're good.
Right.
So they steal all of Liam's money. And then they go to this kind of like brothel auction thing um, with so Liam and his friends are there, and Dolores and Caleb are there. Connells is there as part of kind of Liam's cohort, and then of course Bernard and Ashley are there because they are trying to find Liam because they think that he has been replaced by Dolores already. So they're kind of trying to not infiltrate but disrupt Dolores's plans with the Liam host as well, or what they think is the Liam host as well. So
Or
yeah,
I was under the impression that they had tracked him down, like that was her target, that she wanted to turn him into a host, but they weren't sure if he had already been turned into a host, uh, or replaced by a host yet. Um, so they were trying to save him. I was kind of what I thought before that happened, but weren't sure if it had already happened. So disrupting and then finding out more information about why it might have happened, or if he had already been switched, what the ultimate plan was. It's a good idea, good thought.
yeah. Well, and whenever they very first encounter Liam there, uh, Bernard immediately is like diagnostic, blah blah blah, like trying to commandeer that host. So they definitely assumed that Liam had already been replaced by a host, and kind of seemed surprised that he hadn't. And then we're like, okay, well, in this case, we're here to save you.
Right, right. Good
um,
point.
so they'd assumed that Liam was already a host, but whenever they realized that he wasn't, I think that's kind of when they essentially called an audible and were like, okay, well, in that case, we're disrupting it in this way by kind of taking you out of play more than anything else. So at the brothel auction, Liam also realizes that all of his money is gone, and he like phones Connells and is like, "Yo, this is crazy. Where's my money? What's going on?" And Connells is speaking with Dolores, like, "Hey, our ex-boyfriend," and I loved how because at this point we don't even know that Musashi is Dolores yet. It's like, hey, our ex-boyfriend, blah blah blah. And so it's kind of one of those like internal like cues that, oh hey, Connells is Dolores, which I didn't pick up on my first watch, but on my second watch was like, our ex-boyfriend, exactly. So realizes his financial straits, and so he's trying to call Connells and find out where his money is. And while he's kind of storming off to find him, that's whenever Bernard and Ashley kind of try to commandeer him, realize that he's not in fact a host, and try to usher him to safety, but are met by Dolores and Caleb. And Dolores kind of like comes out guns a-blazing, trying to commandeer Liam from them. And they kind of take off. Dolores and Ashley fight, whereas Bernard and Liam kind of run with Caleb in tow. Connell's comes whenever they're kind of having their altercation kind of in the alleyway behind the brothel auction. And of course, Liam at first is like, yes, my savior. But he's not, in fact, Liam's savior. He is, of course, Dolores, and we kind of get that reveal after after Connell's tells Liam and Caleb to go and run. Bernard and Connell's have some sort of an exchange where that identity is revealed, with Bernard at gunpoint. And I'm really, really curious to see what kind of happens in that exchange as well, because that's kind of where that one is left. And
yeah, this kind of left us hanging.
I really wonder where that goes, because Bernard kind of interfacing with them is going to have some really, really interesting consequences, I think. But we don't get that in this episode. So
we need something for the last few.
Exactly. So Connell's lets Liam and Caleb go. Caleb tracks down, catches Liam, and Dolores catches up with them. And that is kind of the last part of Dolores and Caleb's heist. They stole all of Liam's money. They commandeered him. To what end? We're not sure yet. And Bernard and Ashley tried to disrupt Dolores and Caleb's plans, power grab with Liam, and are largely unsuccessful, but we will see kind of what happens with Bernard and Connell's right there. Is Bernard able to convince Connell / that particular Dolores to change his ways? Is kind of what happens with that exchange is, I think, going to be really, really interesting.
Honestly, I think that one's probably going to be a bit of hand wash, and that because of the way the fight between Dolores and Stubbs went, where she just kind of threw him over the banister, I kind of get the feeling that he's going to, or Stubbs is just going to get up and find them and save Bernard, so that interaction becomes a little bit more limited than maybe we're expecting that intrigue to go. But then we still have the buddy cops between Bernard and Stubbs, trying to figure out the whole story, and this kind of feels like it's turning into a bit of their maze.
It really does, and I love how they play off of each other. It's really, really fun.
Yeah, it's sad because Stubbs is completely controlled, but
True. So, is there anything else you want to say about Dolores and Caleb's heist / Bernard's disruption before we go on to Charlotte seizing power?
I just want to say, I think that this plot line in this particular episode was, it didn't add a lot of new revelations to the story, but it really advanced it, and I thought the stories were told really well, as far as it was just a good time kind of action flick progression of a story, rather than anything really deep that you had to think a lot about. So you need some of those in Westworld.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think while it advanced the plot, there wasn't that kind of deeper thinking, which particularly Caleb's stories, at the very least this season, obviously, tend to have. And I'm excited to see both the plot advancement and the deeper thinking parts of that as well.
Which I think is where the last plot line really hits us in this episode.
Very much so. So that last plot line is Charlotte seizing power / William's descent into madness, quote unquote madness.
Or like we say here, the identity crisis, right?
Yes. So William is having an identity crisis at the very beginning. His daughter is kind of antagonizing him, and she's got like the bullet wound from where he killed her that keeps on popping up and bleeding all over her clothes and whatnot. So she's definitely providing that psychological torture that's kind of leading to and reinforcing his identity crisis on whether he's a host or not, which is still a very big question. Um, and of course, like how much agency he had in killing her, whether that was his choice because he thought she was a host, which is kind of his approach to it. But he's also saying, "Oh well, I didn't have a choice in it." Well, if you didn't have a choice, that kind of exchange with how much agency did you have, and if you did have agency, then you killed your daughter.
Right. And there's other flashbacks to like the bathroom, the bathtub, where he wakes up and is drowning, and that's presumably the same one that his wife killed herself in. He's
Mm-hmm.
definitely being reminded of all of the impact that his uh, evilness in the park had on his real life, replaying in his mind over and over. And it may have been a little overacted how I know what's real, shooting mirrors and trashing a really nice place, but you definitely get the sense that he's struggling with with understanding his place in the world.
Absolutely. Um, so one of the kind of questions that I had in this, in particular, was with his daughter antagonizing him. Was she a hallucination, or I didn't have a really good vocabulary for this one, so I put or a machination. Is she something that was programmed into him, if he is in fact a host, to kind of torture him, to kind of hopefully push him towards that descent into madness? Um, that's kind of a question that I had in general.
And that's a really difficult one to answer because we're not 100% certain of what he is or who he is. So, um, you at the very end, then you see him get injected with something. We know that there's a bunch of different things that you might need to inject somebody for. Is Dolores doing it? There's a drug that was introduced to that causes hallucinations. So if he's
Mm-hmm.
real, then maybe it is that. If he's a host, then maybe it is something that's being programmed in. Since Charlotte does mention that, she's been watching those conversations and possibly even adding those conversations in for him to struggle with. But that then requires her to know a little bit more about that interaction. I'm not sure she was there in the park or if that would even be recorded um, on the guests in the park, that if it affected something other than a host. So
That's true. And I think particularly the Charlotte Dolores might have a little bit more knowledge about it, and here's why. Um, the park employees kind of come across William and his daughter, and whenever William kills all of them, and his daughter has William's like code thing,
key card.
yeah, that key card thing in her hand whenever she dies. Um, and so Charlotte Dolores would be kind of uniquely positioned to have access to that information, as well as perhaps even William's key card and whatnot, as well as the general, essentially like security footage of the park as well. So she might have a little bit more knowledge, but again, that's kind of hand waving too.
Yeah, it just seems like at the point where that happened, there was so much chaos in the park that I kind of doubt the system's availability and the security footage that would still be available after the host's raid on the um, Mesa facility and things like that. So, but you're right. It's possible, I guess, that everything was still recording and not destroyed in the takeover, and then later reviewed. And that's how they would also know that they were missing uh, hosts in the park and things like that.
True. So whenever Charlotte kind of comes to William and she convinces him to help her take Delos private, she mentions Sirach's, though doesn't mention him by name, Sirach's
I
corporate
thought she did.
buyout. Um,
I thought she did actually mention
oh,
his
did
name.
she? I think you're
Maybe
right.
not. I thought she did because he had some interactions with him previously where he was the one that initially sold the data to Sirach so that he would get a feel for what information was available.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think she did mention his name. Um, but mentions the corporate takeover nonetheless. Uh, and he is like, "Hey, you're you're the one who's screwing this up. Like this is on you." And she's like, "Well, do you want to lose your company or not?"
And at first he was like, okay, that's fine. He can have it. I don't care. But then they mentioned some secret project in Sector 16, was it?
hmm
Which I was kind of believing to be the Valley Beyond, but then I'm not sure why he would suddenly care and want to save the company. So I think we still have things to be revealed there.
Yeah, it kind of seems like to me that the project is probably the guests data that they were collecting all along, and that perhaps whenever Dolores sent the Valley Beyond out into the ether or wherever she sent that to, perhaps she sent all of the guest data there as well. Um, that's the most that I can really kind of rationalize it, because that would really be the data that Sirach in particular would be seeking, right?
And it seems like that is what Sirach is seeking, and so that would be what. But I don't see why William would necessarily care about that. Although I guess I could see if it was the fidelity testing to keep people alive forever, he might care more about that, um, especially if he knows or has an inkling that he was one that was being tested, as we saw at the end of season two.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Um,
what
one
the
of
more nefarious purposes were.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I think he would not want that to kind of come out is that one of the things particularly that Dolores and Caleb were talking about in, I think it was last episode, where they were talking about the kind of privacy laws, how Insight was able to collect all of this info before those were kind of essentially a thing. Um, and if Delos was breaking those while they were still a thing, um, then William might not want it to come out that, hey, we've been collecting this info on you that this entire time, even after this was no longer a an allowed or a legal thing, after it was prohibited. So maybe that's why he would care.
But the people that would be using it wouldn't reveal that because they want that data. So I
True.
don't know. It could be just they needed something, so they're gonna postpone this, and it's a whole new project that we weren't aware of. Um, it's, I guess that's kind of where I'm leaning now. That I don't know what that project would be that would spark such an interest suddenly, um, to prevent that data getting out.
Mm-hmm.
Everything
Um,
else I have a reason why it doesn't matter.
right. So at the end of the day, Charlotte does convince William to help her to take Delos private, and so he kind of cleans up a bit, and she helps him shave at one point, which is a little odd, and at the very
But
least, to me, could have been a clue to should have been a clue to him that she is Dolores rather than Charlotte, because I don't know that Charlotte would have been quite as subservient to him like that.
that harkens back to season 1, and I don't remember who it was, but it seems like he had an adversary in season 1 that shaved him at one point. Whether it was Lewis or Lawrence or somebody down that path. I seem to recall him getting shaved by someone in a very similar situation where it's quite adversarial.
Oh, that's a really cool parallel. I did not
And
connect those two.
and then especially as she's shaving and has the razor right up against his neck, then she basically is talking about how there's a mole, and he's like, "Are
Hmm.
you the mole?" While she's got the razor right there on his neck. So he's getting some of his stature, I guess, or general confidence back that we saw in earlier seasons, where he knows everything and is going to wax poetic about everything. And yeah, it's just confident again, which then could have led to the betrayal at the end instead of using his help, um, abandoning it and stealing it.
Hmm. So, in that exchange, Charlotte is successful in convincing William to help her, um, and he cleans up, and whenever he's kind of getting ready to leave, he's talking with his daughter. He basically tells her that yes, it was his choice. He had that agency. It's because he thought that she was a host. So he's kind of at this point claiming that agency, um, which I found kind of empowering and kind of him coming out of that rut. Whether he's still seeing his daughter or not, be that a hallucination or a machination. Um, he's kind of coming out of the other side. Well, Charlotte, of course, heard all of that and is like, hey, uh, did she believe you? Blah, blah, blah. And he's like, you've been spying on me? Kind of like you were talking about earlier. And she's like, yeah, of course I had to do that thing. Um, and they have this really contentious exchange where Charlotte is revealed to be Dolores. And she's kind of like walking away, and he uh, comes after her, and he's like, "I'm gonna get you. I'm gonna tear you limb from limb." And the people who are around there kind of restrain him. He's like, "You work for me," and she's like, "No, I told you they don't work for you. They this is a psychiatric facility. Blah blah blah." So at the end of the day, she has him committed. She kind of goes over and like after they inject him with a thing to basically subdue him. She goes over and is like talking to him and kind of pricks him on the side with something that's kind of protruding from her finger. She kind of like, and that I think is the code. Could have been the code if he's a host that she injects him with, or it could be if he is not a host, some sort of psychedelic or something like that to have him continue to hallucinate. So at this point, I pretty well believe that William is a host, um, and I think that she was probably this is my one of my theories. I think that she was injecting him with the essentially Dolores strain, and that's why he encounters Dolores in the psychiatric facility whenever he's institutionalized. He encounters Dolores, and they start speaking with one another. Whenever William is committed, Charlotte, now having been revealed to be Dolores, reveals to him that she will have his voting shares as the interim president once he has been kind of voted to be seen as not able to exercise his free will or whatnot, which the institutionalization leads to. And of course, that's what has him snap. Or that's right after he snaps. I'm sorry. But that is why, kind of at the end of the day, since the end result is Charlotte seizing power, that's why we ended up calling this plot line Charlotte seizing power, because at the end of the day, she has his voting shares. She's able to take the company private and kind of start steering that ship.
To the institutionalization, blah, hard to say.
Uh-huh.
That part was very interesting to me because it's not like any institution that I would have ever pictured. It's still a very extravagant location that he's in, and he's left alone. So he's sitting in this large ceilinged room, not restrained in any way, just kind of sitting there on his own, but in the institutionalized outfit, right?
Mm-hmm.
When he's greeted by Charlotte, or by Dolores, and so that leads me to believe this is one of those isolated containers of virtual world, sort of like where Charlotte meets with Serac the first time, or where Maeve meets with Serac the first time. It's just the two of them in this extravagant place. Because why would you bother creating a not extravagant virtual meeting room?
Right.
And then when Dolores shows up and is going down a line of questioning for him, then she asks him, to ask the question out loud, what his question is, right? What is the real question? And you're kind of led to believe that he's going to ask, "Am I real?" But instead he says, "Am I me?"
Right.
Which then makes you wonder. He must know that he's not real, that he is a host. And so if it was an injection that has the Dolores code, like you had mentioned, which makes perfect sense to me, then he's going to feel that taking over him. And I think that can also be used that what I was saying in the last episode, where there was a lot of times when Dolores's interactions, just the way she dressed, to the way she interacted with Caleb, the way she interacted with other people in the environment, at times seemed very Man in Blackish.
Mm-hmm.
That this is a different timeline than slightly from the Caleb and Dolores story, where she must take his pearl at some point and use it in her own body, or a body of her, just for that cold-bloodedness and confidence that he had in the first couple of seasons. So I'm really excited to see if that is the way that it goes. And seeing that I was right about Charlotte being Dolores from the past, then I'll take credit for this one too before it's revealed, or I'll be seen as a total fool.
No, I think you're completely right. And I honestly think that the end of the Charlotte and William kind of arc is going to be the beginning of the Maeve, Dolores, Caleb arc. And maybe they're three separate arcs where it's like the Dolores, Caleb, Stubbs, Bernard arc. There's that one. Then there's the William and Charlotte arc, and then there's the Maeve and Serac arc, right? So to me, at the very least, there are those three kind of different. I mean, we even have them kind of as separate areas in our basic plots, right? So it kind of seems like it's a multiple different things, right? So there's Dolores and Caleb seizing power, which I think happens. Okay, so first there's Charlotte and William. So this is where Dolores is taking control of Delos, kind of finding out that they're not the kind of end all be all, the precipice. And so from there, she realizes that she needs to kind of seize power from Insight and or the algorithm, and so she's trying to seize power there. So I think that the result of this is my theory of which timeline is which. So William and Charlotte timeline happens first, and that's when Dolores kind of, I think one of the end things there is that Dolores is going to absorb the Man in Black code. I think that she's going to appropriate that because she's very much the Man in Black in the Dolores and Caleb kind of timeline.
But also in the Dolores and Charlotte timeline.
True. Very true. That's a really good point. Oh, I didn't even think about where that one comes into play because yeah, I think that is a very different one as well. It could be in the Dolores and Caleb heist timeline. That could be rolled into that one. Hmm.
The timelines are really confusing to me here, and I think that it was so much easier in the first two seasons, really, because there was 30 years difference between where some of them were, whereas
Right.
now we're kind of, hey, these are probably all happened within the same 5 years or 3 to 5 years period.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really everybody looks the same age and whatnot throughout, so it's really difficult to differentiate.
And what I
Hopefully, it
think,
becomes more clear.
yeah, what I think will be really interesting to see is whether, because I think that William or Charlotte seizing power and William's absorption of code into Dolores and or taking over the Dolores code himself, who knows? Um, I think that happens first. But what I think will be really interesting to see is where the Maeve and Sirach kind of timeline is, whether that's a reaction to Dolores and Caleb seizing power from Liam, or whether he's kind of at odds with them. And I think we'll probably see that later. And I imagine that's probably the same timeline, but it could be a very different one as well. And I think that to me will be kind of the most interesting one to see kind of where that fits.
Agreed. Like, is his reaction more because they kept him from getting access to the Delos company, and so he's trying to steal the information from within, or vice versa, where he's tried to steal the information from within and then tries to steal the company? So getting these placed is going to be hard to resolve in 3 episodes, though, I think. So I'm looking forward to season 4 already.
Me too.
Hopefully they won't take 2 years off in between.
No joke. Yeah, hopefully this is their like, okay, we have what could be one amazing, really, really big, huge season that we're gonna split up into 2 seasons. And so
And
they're
that's why
able to
there's
spend more time on it.
episodes, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's why this one only has 8 episodes, because it's kind of essentially season 3 part 1, whereas the next season might really be season 3 part 2.
I like it.
At least that's my theory for that as well, since I'm spitting out theories today.
I like it.
So what theories do you have at this point in the season, Guy Grumpy?
I think we've covered most of what I've got. That we still haven't. I don't think we've seen the real world yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like we're still in simulations, and that in these simulations, then we've taken some of the sub simulations back a step into this virtual world, future world, and that we are going to see more of an identity crisis for a lot of the characters that have made that jump from the theme parks into the virtual world, as they come to the realization that we're still not there yet. There's another level up that we have to get through before we're real.
So, who all do you think might be really real? I think Sirach is probably a given that he's probably real. Who else do you think might be? And or do you disagree with my assumption, my base assumption that Sirach is real?
I disagree with the base assumption that Sirach is real. I feel like Sirach is kind of like in the Matrix movies, the architect, or in the 13th floor, the developer of that technology. So he's to me like a rogue virtual agent that wants to ascend himself. So I'm kind of seeing he is not real. I think if there is anybody real, we haven't seen them in the real world, but Caleb seems like he could be real still, and that this simulation has come back to his therapy, trying to overcome some of the things that he's gone through with his mother, with his best friend from the army, and him coming to terms with that. I think that William also was real, and maybe finds his way back towards that life. Although obviously not as a real person anymore. He has to be in the host because it's been too long now.
Mm-hmm. As far as side characters go, do you think that the pedophile from the other episode is kind of an example of a real person that we saw kind of experiencing that other park of Future World?
So that one's difficult because I'm not sure if Future World is the virtual world or a theme park.
Fair point.
So if the virtual world, then yeah, I could see him being real. But yeah, that's a really great question. A lot of these side characters, it I guess I'm really struggling with the purpose of the virtual worlds. In that the theme parks made perfect sense as a place where people could go and act out on their primal desires and find who they really are and become, they could be whatever they want to be.
Right.
The virtual worlds seem to be a little bit more targeted, like the war world was really a way to test Maeve and see if she could find her way to these other virtual beings that were put there specifically for her to interact with. That she found what's his name? The narrative person.
Oh,
and
Lee Sizemore.
He led her to Lee Sizemore, and he led her to the virtual version of the Valley Beyond, or the Forge, where that was created, so that they could maybe find some information that way. The virtual world where Sirach comes in and pops in for Maeve, brings her code in to talk to her and get her to fight Dolores, is set up specifically for that. The institution that they put William in is set up to get information from him. So it feels to me like those are more for information gathering. And if that's the case, then the pedophile from the last episode would be more of a test of Charlotte then, and whether that's to see what her primal response would be, or to try to drive her more towards a human response, or see how far she'd deviate from Dolores's expectations of her. Then in that case, then he would just be a setup, right? So
good point.
I think we'll learn more about the virtual worlds, if I'm right, that they are more setups and more tests, more mazes that you need to figure out to actually achieve or attain consciousness.
That is a really good question, and in fact, kind of, I think, fundamental question and fundamental theory of what and why are the virtual worlds, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what and why those are.
So apart from Sirach, what do you think? Do you think we've seen any real people? I know you've started to subscribe a little bit more to the virtual worlds, but is anybody else real?
So. I think that Bernard might be real.
Really?
And I think that he may have kind of essentially gotten brainwashed into not remembering, whatnot, kind of like you said, a test of almost his fidelity and whatnot. And that may be why he's a little bit more incorruptible by like the Dolores or whatnot, because even though she like brings his personality, which if he's real but in a virtual world, yeah, he could still be a Pearl, right? I don't see why not.
Yeah, good point.
So I don't think that the hosts are necessarily excluded from being real, particularly with the kind of identity not necessarily crisis, but the grappling with reality that he's had. I think that William, yeah, I think that Sirach might still be real, and that he's kind of taking a more like business-like approach to kind of the different things, the different virtual realities, where it's kind of like real money has been poured into like WoW and World of Warcraft, and kind of essentially putting money into the economy there, and okay, that this, that, or the other has kind of a sort of real world kind of value to it. And I think that he might just be kind of a rich business person who kind of sees that as well, and is kind of taking advantage of the internal economy so that then he can kind of utilize it in some sort of an external way as well. Though the way that you explain that, I'm less sure about that than I was before our conversation. So I wouldn't be surprised if he's not kind of real either.
So interesting, when you were just talking about that, it kind of reminded me a lot of how Ford interacted with the hosts and things, that he's aware, and so he wants to ensure that there is that line, and Sirach is acting very much the same, and their outfits looked very much the same from when they were kids, right? When they showed the fields of Paris burning, it's like they're both wearing the same exact style, and maybe that's just a stylization of, hey, this is what Europe looked like in the early 2000s when you were rich kids. But I wonder if there might be a link there that does make them a bit more real.
That's a good point. Ford could be one of those real people as well. And we might, in fact, see him popping back up eventually if he is. That would be really interesting.
It would be. I feel like we still have him as part of the Bernard thing, but I'm a little less sure of that now because of Dolores being injected everywhere and Dolores having presumably Bernard's pearl. So
that's a really good point.
But yeah, I don't think we've seen the last of him. He was the biggest name, so surely he'll be back.
Especially with the kind of catapulting of particularly Tessa Thompson into like everything, like into the kind of world stage as a serious actor, being able to kind of have Anthony Hopkins and her both interact once they kind of are those more household names would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
So Grumpy, is there anything else you would like to say before we wrap this up?
Not at this time. Thank you very much for having me as always, and let's watch tomorrow.
I cannot wait. While you in fact do wait, please be sure to check out my friend GuyGrumpy at twitch.tv/GuyGrumpy and or Twitter at twitter.com/GuyGrumpy. Or at GuyGrumpy. I don't know how people say the Twitter stuff. I'm very recently started actually like using Twitter for more than just like, hey, I'm going live and stuff. And it's been a lot of fun, but I haven't really kind of gotten into the lingo quite as much yet. You can find me at twitch.tv/ElectricSheepCity. And of course, on Twitter at eSheepCity. Please join our Discord, which can be found at discord.gg/ a number of things. Go to the Twitter to find exactly the kind of file name for that, but it is discord.gg/MW capital X lowercase r capital N lowercase s capital R. Yeah, as I said, it's a whole hash of numbers or letters, alphanumeric characters, only alpha characters. So go to Twitter, or in fact twitch.tv/ElectricSheepCity and type !Discord, and you can find that link there as well. please, in fact, do join us in our Westworld, our Electric Grumpy World channel in the Discord for some conversations there as well. It's always a lot of fun. Our intro and outro music has been provided by Shade Swiper and commissioned by our very own GuyGrumpy. And you can find her at twitter.com how do we do the Twitter thing? It's at, right?
Just at, yeah.
Just at. See, I need to get into the Twitter thing. At Shade Swiper. She can be found there. And she's also amazing. Thank y'all very much for joining us this evening. You stay electric and you stay grumpy, world.
Yeah.